winter of 1941, the Empire of Japan stood at the height of its military confidence. For over a decade, Tokyo had watched the Western powers dominate Asia with fleets that stretched from the Indian Ocean to the Pacific. The Japanese High Command saw it as both humiliation and opportunity, a chance to build an empire born of steel, oil, and ambition. The solution was simple in theory, radical in execution. Strike first, strike hard, and cripple America before it could awaken. At dawn on December 7, 1941, Japan's carrier strike force, the Kido Butai, swept through the skies above Pearl Harbor. In less than 2 hours, the U.S. Pacific Fleet was left burning. Battleships lay capsized in the shallow waters, oil and fire spreading across the harbor like ink. For the first time in its history, the United States Navy had been dealt a catastrophic surprise. The news reached Tokyo like thunder. Crowds gathered beneath radio towers and cheered the names of their heroes: Nagumo, Yamamoto, Fuchida. The Emperor's navy had achieved what even the most daring strategists had considered impossible. Across Asia, Japanese troops advanced with breathtaking speed, seizing Hong Kong, Malaya, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies. The Imperial Navy believed its power absolute. 6 fleet carriers, 4 battleships, and an air arm that had proven itself over China and Southeast Asia. To them, aircraft carriers were extensions of the empire's reach, tools for dominance, not survival. Their doctrine still revolved around the battleship, massive, armored, and equipped with guns that could hurl shells across 20 miles. The carrier, in their view, was an auxiliary weapon, a scout for the real instruments of victory. When reports arrived that the Americans were regrouping around a handful of surviving carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, Lexington, and Yorktown, Japanese officers laughed. These floating airfields, they thought, were fragile, vulnerable, toys compared to the towering dreadnoughts of the Imperial Navy. But beneath the surface of that confidence lay a fatal flaw. While Japan celebrated, the United States was already mobilizing its unmatched industrial might. Within weeks, shipyards from San Diego to Brooklyn began working around the clock. Aircraft factories turned out new models at unprecedented speed. The Pacific Fleet's losses were grievous, but they had also simplified one critical truth. America's future rested not on the battleship, but on the carrier. In the months following Pearl Harbor, Japan's victories continued almost without pause. The Battle of the Java Sea in February 1942 ended with Allied cruisers destroyed and their navies shattered. Even the British Royal Navy, once master of the oceans, suffered humiliation when Japanese aircraft sank the Prince of Wales and Repulse, both powerful battleships, without warning. Every triumph reinforced the same dangerous belief that Japan's pilots were unbeatable, its carriers invincible, and its naval strategy unshakable. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, was less certain. A gambler at heart but a realist in mind, he knew that Japan's window for dominance was brief. For 6 months, he had warned, "I can run wild. After that, I can promise nothing." Those 6 months were nearing their end. By the spring of 1942, small cracks began to show. The Battle of the Coral Sea, being fought in May, had halted Japan's advance toward Port Moresby. It was the first naval battle fought entirely by aircraft, with ships never sighting one another. The Japanese lost the light carrier Shoho, and 2 of their main carriers were damaged. For the first time, the myth of invincibility wavered. Still, Tokyo refused to see weakness. Yamamoto pushed forward with a grand plan, one that would lure the Americans into a trap at a small, isolated atoll known as Midway. He believed it would end the war before the United States could recover. But in hidden rooms beneath Pearl Harbor, American intelligence officers were already listening. The Japanese laughed at America's toy carriers. The Americans were preparing to use those very toys to change the course of the Pacific War. In the aftermath of Pearl Harbor, the United States faced a reckoning. The Pacific Fleet was crippled. Battleships, the pride of American naval power, lay in ruins at the bottom of the harbor. But within weeks, the shock turned into resolve. Factories began to hum. Men enlisted in droves. The aircraft carrier, once considered an auxiliary tool, now became the central pillar of America's naval doctrine. 3 carriers survived Pearl Harbor untouched: Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga. Soon they were joined by Hornet and Yorktown. These ships, though few, became America's new sword, fast, mobile, and unpredictable. They could strike hundreds of miles away, vanish, and strike again. Rear Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, newly appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, understood what was at stake. He knew that America could not outnumber Japan yet, but it could outthink it. Intelligence, not firepower, would turn the tide. In early 1942, U.S. codebreakers at Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor, a cramped, windowless building filled with cigarette smoke, radios, and typewriters, began unraveling fragments of Japan's naval communications. Among them was a crucial clue, references to an operation against a target designated AF. No one knew what AF meant, but Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team had a suspicion it might be Midway Atoll, a tiny speck of land roughly halfway between Asia and North America. To confirm it, the Americans devised a clever trick. Midway was ordered to send a fake message by radio that its freshwater plant had broken down. Within hours, Japanese intelligence intercepted and reported that AF was short of water. Rochefort's team had their proof. The trap was set. While the codebreakers worked in silence, Nimitz moved with remarkable calm. Against the advice of some subordinates, he decided to confront the Japanese fleet head-on. It would be a battle of nerve and foresight, fought not with brute force but with timing, deception, and luck. Meanwhile, Japan's Admiral Yamamoto was preparing what he believed would be a decisive strike. His grand strategy, Operation MI, aimed to destroy the remaining U.S. carriers by luring them into a trap near Midway. 4 of Japan's most powerful carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, would lead the assault, accompanied by over 200 aircraft and a vast armada of battleships and cruisers. Yamamoto envisioned a complex operation involving multiple task forces spread across thousands of miles, an orchestra of precision. But complexity is a double-edged sword. Communication delays, long distances, and overconfidence all threatened to unravel his plan. Yamamoto's fleet operated under the assumption that America was still reeling, its carrier forces hesitant and weak. What he didn't know was that U.S. scouts had already spotted his movements days before the first bombs fell. Across the Pacific, aboard the carrier Enterprise, Admiral Raymond Spruant studied reconnaissance maps late into the night. He was an analytical man, a replacement for the more aggressive William Halsey, who had fallen ill. Beside him was Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher aboard Yorktown, whose ship still bore the scars of Coral Sea but had been hastily repaired in record time. The deck smelled of fresh paint and fuel. Many of the crew believed the ship shouldn't even be at sea, but it would sail and straight into history. By early June 1942, both fleets were moving toward Midway, unaware of how close they already were. The ocean stretched vast and empty, hiding carriers on both sides, each waiting for the other to blink first. In Tokyo, High Command expected another effortless victory. Japan's naval officers toasted the coming triumph, confident that the Americans would be crushed once and for all. The imperial press promised the final blow to American sea power. But beneath the quiet decks of 3 American carriers, the mood was different, tense, uncertain, yet resolute. Pilots prepared for battle, unaware that within hours many would never return. Mechanics worked without sleep. Chaplains whispered prayers. Above them all, in the blackness of the Pacific sky, the first glimmers of dawn began to rise. The stage was set for the most decisive battle in naval history. War is not fought by machines alone. It is carried on the nerves, fears, and resolve of the men who face it. By June 1942, Japan's naval aviators were the elite of the world. Veterans of China, the Philippines, and Pearl Harbor. They had trained for years under grueling discipline, mastering dive bombing and torpedo runs with near-perfect coordination. They believed themselves untouchable. Their American counterparts were younger, less experienced, and in many cases untested. Many had never seen combat, yet among them was a growing spirit, the quiet defiance of men who had survived Pearl Harbor and Coral Sea, and who refused to let the Pacific fall without a fight. On the flight decks of Enterprise and Hornet, the morning briefings were calm and spare. Pilots listened as commanders explained the plan, tracing flight paths over maps taped to the walls. There was no grand speech, just the unspoken understanding that they were about to meet the same fleet that had struck Pearl Harbor. Some smiled nervously, others smoked in silence. Letters home were folded and tucked away. In the Japanese fleet, the atmosphere was one of ritual and confidence. Pilots bowed before takeoff, their aircraft adorned with the red sun of the Empire. They believed the coming strike on Midway would be swift, a destruction of American resistance in one clean blow. They did not know that their enemy already knew their plans. In the space between overconfidence and desperation, the human story of Midway was written. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's strategy for Midway was rooted in a single assumption, that the element of surprise would once again belong to Japan. His fleet was divided into several task forces, a main carrier group to attack Midway, a separate group of battleships following behind, and another fleet sent north to the Aleutians to create a diversion. It was an elegant plan and on paper, but in practice it stretched Japan's forces thin and demanded flawless timing. The Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu carried over 250 aircraft. Their mission was to destroy the American airfield on Midway, lure out the remaining U.S. carriers and annihilate them with overwhelming force. Admiral Nimitz, however, understood something Yamamoto didn't. That complexity is the enemy of surprise. Guided by decoded Japanese communications, Nimitz placed his 3 carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, northeast of Midway, in perfect ambush position. He did not need to find the Japanese. The Japanese would come to him. Midway itself, though small, became a fortress. Runways were lined with bombers, torpedo planes, and anti-aircraft guns manned by Marines. The island's defenders knew they might not survive, but they also knew they stood as the first and last line between Japan and Hawaii. Tactically, the battle would hinge on timing. Who would find whom first? Yamamoto's carriers launched their first strike at dawn on June 4th, sending waves of bombers to destroy Midway's airfield. The island was hit hard but not silenced. American pilots scrambled into the air, their outdated planes, Buffaloes and Wildcats, flying straight into the teeth of Japan's Zero fighters. Most didn't make it back, but their sacrifice bought time. Time for Nimitz's carriers to strike, time for history to turn. In the shadows of the Pacific War, victory began not with ships or bombs, but with typewriters and radio intercepts. The men of Station Hypo were not soldiers. They were linguists, mathematicians, and engineers who worked in silence behind closed doors. They listened to fragments of Japanese transmissions, pieced together call signs, and reconstructed meaning from static. By late May, their work had revealed nearly everything Yamamoto planned: the date, the direction, even the number of carriers. It was an intelligence victory unmatched in naval history. But Nimitz faced a dilemma. If the Japanese realized their codes were broken, they would change them immediately. So the Americans crafted their response carefully. Midway would appear unprepared. The U.S. fleet would appear surprised. In truth, every move would be deliberate. While Yamamoto's ship sailed in confidence, believing they held the upper hand, Nimitz's forces waited in silence. Reconnaissance patrols fanned across the ocean, searching for the first sighting of the Japanese fleet. The tension aboard the American carriers was unbearable. Hours stretched like days. On the morning of June 3rd, a PBY Catalina flying boat finally spotted the Japanese invasion force approaching from the northwest. The message reached Nimitz almost immediately. The trap was working. Intelligence had done what even battleships could not. It had turned the tide of the Pacific before a single shot was fired. And as the sun rose over June 4th, both fleets prepared for a battle neither side fully understood. The Battle of Midway was a confrontation between two visions of naval warfare, the past and the future. Japan's navy entered the war believing in the supremacy of the battleship, massive, armored, and armed with guns capable of striking targets over 20 miles away. The battleship had been the symbol of national power for decades. Carriers were seen as support vessels, useful for reconnaissance and preliminary strikes, but never decisive. America, forced by circumstance, reversed that belief almost overnight. The devastation of Pearl Harbor left its battleships crippled. The only surviving assets capable of striking back were carriers. In them, Nimitz saw not weakness but opportunity. A carrier was more than a ship. It was a floating airfield capable of launching dozens of aircraft across hundreds of miles. It could project power without being seen. Its range made geography irrelevant. Its flexibility made strategy dynamic. Midway would prove this truth beyond any doubt. Technological adaptation gave the Americans an edge Japan didn't expect. American dive bombers like the Douglas SBD Dauntless had been improved with stronger engines and more precise bomb sights. U.S. radar, still primitive by modern standards, allowed for early warnings that Japan lacked. Even small design details, like better damage control systems and armored flight decks, would soon make the difference between survival and annihilation. The Japanese carriers, though formidable, were fragile. Their hangars were crowded with fuel lines, stacked torpedoes, and loaded aircraft, a volatile mix that could ignite in seconds. Japanese training emphasized attack precision but not defensive coordination. They had mastered the art of the strike but not of recovery. Midway would expose this imbalance brutally. Technology, once Japan's greatest advantage, was about to turn against it. Leadership at Midway was a contest of temperament as much as tactics. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto was a man of intellect and contradictions. Harvard-educated, fluent in English, and deeply aware of America's industrial potential. He had opposed war with the United States, but once ordered to fight, he committed with absolute focus. His strategy at Midway was complex, elegant, and ambitious, perhaps too much so. By contrast, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz embodied calm precision. He trusted his subordinates, delegated decisively, and relied heavily on intelligence. His key commanders, Admirals Frank Jack Fletcher and Raymond Spruance, were very different men. Fletcher was cautious and deliberate. Spruance analytical and cool under pressure. Together they formed a leadership triangle built not on hierarchy, but on trust. Where Yamamoto sought to orchestrate a masterpiece, Nimitz sought only to exploit an opening. Where the Japanese command chain stretched over thousands of miles of ocean, Nimitz's orders were direct and unified. Yamamoto's plan required perfect timing. Midway must be bombed, the American carriers drawn out, then annihilated by the waiting battleships. But each phase depended on communication, and the Pacific was vast. As the battle unfolded, his forces lost contact with each other and the fog of war began to close in. Spruance, operating from Enterprise, made decisions within minutes that changed history. When reports came of Japanese carriers sighted to the northwest, he ordered an immediate strike, even though not all planes were fully armed or refueled. It was a gamble born of instinct and faith in timing. In leadership, boldness is often mistaken for recklessness, but at Midway the bold would prevail, and because hesitation would be fatal. Every great battle carries within it a moral lesson, often learned in hindsight. For Japan, Midway was the consequence of arrogance, the belief that victory at Pearl Harbor had guaranteed the empire's destiny. The laughter aboard Akagi on the morning of June 4th was not cruelty but certainty, the unshakable faith in their own superiority. The Americans, for their part, fought not from pride but from necessity. They were not seeking conquest but survival. Their pilots climbed into aircraft that were inferior in speed and maneuverability, but carried with them something less tangible, the weight of loss, the memory of a burning harbor, and the determination to strike back. War reduces nations to their core traits. At Midway, Japan's perfectionism became rigidity. America's improvisation became strength. As the two fleets closed in, no one on either side could see the full scale of what was coming. For some, it was another mission. For others, a final flight. The Pacific shimmered beneath them, endless, indifferent, waiting. And above that horizon, hidden by clouds, history's balance was about to shift. June 4, 1942, 04:30 hours. The sky over the Pacific was just beginning to glow faintly at the edges when the first engines roared to life aboard Japan's carriers. On Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, flight crews rushed across the decks, securing bombs and torpedoes beneath sleek Mitsubishi Zeros and Nakajima B-5N Kate bombers. Orders echoed across steel corridors. The first strike would hit Midway itself, destroy its airfield, silence its guns, and lure out the American carriers for destruction. By 04:30, 108 aircraft rose from the decks, glinting in the dawn light. Below them, the Japanese fleet continued on, confident and precise. The Americans, they believed, were far to the east, unaware, unready. But they were wrong. Before the Japanese planes even reached Midway, American radar operators on the island had already detected them. Air raid sirens wailed across the tiny atoll. Pilots scrambled to their aircraft, engines coughing to life as the first shadows appeared overhead. The sky erupted in streaks of tracer fire. The Japanese attack was brutal but incomplete. Runways were cratered, fuel tanks burned, but the island's defenses held. Communications remained intact. Midway was bloodied, not broken. As the Japanese strike group turned back toward their carriers, reports began to reach Admiral Nagumo aboard Akagi. The first wave had done its job, but not enough to guarantee success. Midway still had operational aircraft. A second strike would be necessary. Nagumo faced a decision, one that would decide the fate of Japan's carrier force. At that moment, his decks were being rearmed. Aircraft intended for a second strike on Midway were being refitted with bombs and torpedoes. But before the order was completed, a scout plane from Tone, running late due to mechanical trouble, radioed a new message. Enemy ships sighted, bearing 10 degrees, distance 240 miles. Enemy ships, possibly carriers. Nagumo hesitated. Should he launch immediately with what he had, or recall his aircraft and rearm for a strike against ships instead of land targets? Minutes ticked by. Below deck, crews worked frantically, swapping weapons, refueling planes, moving live ordnance across open hangars. Bombs were hoisted by hand. Torpedoes rolled across the floor. Fuel lines hissed. It was a deadly mix. An entire fleet of carriers turned into floating powder kegs. At 0700 hours, Midway-based American bombers appeared over the Japanese fleet. Their attack was disorganized and largely ineffective. Most planes were shot down before they reached their targets. But every minute they occupied the Japanese fighters above the fleet, they delayed Nagumo's next move. By 0930, another wave appeared. American torpedo bombers from Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown. The TBD Devastator squadrons flew low and slow, easy prey for the Japanese Zeros. Nearly every plane was destroyed. Out of 41 aircraft, only a handful survived. But their sacrifice changed everything. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol, exhausted and low on fuel, had descended to sea level to chase the torpedo planes. Above them, unnoticed, the sky was suddenly empty. At 10:20 hours, the silence broke. From 20,000 feet, 37 American SBD Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown appeared through scattered clouds. They had stumbled upon the Japanese fleet almost by chance, guided by instinct, luck, and desperate timing. Below them lay 3 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, decks crammed with fueled aircraft and live ordnance. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey led the dive. His voice over the radio was calm. "Follow me down." The bombers rolled into their dives. The sound of the wind screamed around them. Bomb bay doors opened. The sea and sky merged into a blur of motion. At 10:22, the first bombs hit Kaga. One struck the forward elevator. Another ripped through the hangar, igniting stored fuel. Within seconds, flames erupted across the deck. On Akagi, a single 1,000-pound bomb detonated amid a line of armed planes, setting off a chain reaction that tore the ship apart. Soryu was hit next. 3 direct strikes that sent her listing and burning, explosions ripping through her hull. In less than 5 minutes, 3 of Japan's frontline carriers were engulfed in fire. Sailors dove into the sea to escape the inferno. Pilots returning from the Midway strike circled helplessly above, unable to land. The once proud Kido Butai, which had ruled the Pacific for half a year, was now a shattered, burning graveyard. The ocean that had carried Japan's laughter now carried its screams. But the battle was not over. One carrier remained, Hiryu, untouched, defiant, preparing to strike back. Amid the burning wrecks of Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, one ship remained alive, Hiryu. Her flight deck still gleamed with order. Her crew moved swiftly, almost silently, as if trying to drown out the horror of what surrounded them. Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, aboard Hiryu, refused to accept defeat. His jaw set, his words few: "We will strike back." At 10:45 hours, Hiryu launched her first counterattack. 18 dive bombers escorted by 0 fighters. They climbed into the sky, guided by vengeance. Below them, the Pacific stretched out, endless, indifferent, scattered with oil fires. Their target, the USS Yorktown. By 1200 hours, the American carriers were repositioning. Pilots from Enterprise and Hornet were returning from their devastating attack, low on fuel and shaken by what they had witnessed. On Yorktown's deck, crews rushed to refuel and rearm for another strike, unaware that Japan's retaliation was already inbound. Radar screens flickered. At 12:01, lookouts shouted, "Incoming!" "Bombers bearing 320!" Sirens blared. Anti-aircraft gunners swung into position. Black puffs of flak burst across the blue sky. The first Japanese bombers dived in formation, sunlight glinting off their wings. American fighters rose to meet them, but there were too few. Yorktown's combat air patrol had been depleted, its pilots exhausted. Within moments, 3 500-pound bombs struck home. One smashed through the flight deck. Another tore open the side of the ship. The third ignited aviation fuel below decks. The carrier shuddered, listing heavily. Smoke poured into the sky, yet the Yorktown refused to die. Her damage control teams worked furiously, sealing compartments, pumping out flooding. Within an hour, fires were contained. Flight operations partially restored. Sailors cheered. It seemed as if she might survive. But Hiryu was not finished. At 14:30, a second Japanese strike force appeared. Torpedo bombers this time. They came in low, skimming the waves. Anti-aircraft guns roared. 2 torpedoes slammed into Yorktown's port side. The ship lurched violently, her engines stalled. Power failed. The proud carrier slowed to a halt, leaning sharply to one side. Admiral Fletcher was forced to transfer his flag to Astoria. At 1500, the order was given to abandon ship. Yorktown drifted silently, her decks scorched, her hull broken, a monument to defiance. But while Hiryu celebrated its success, the Americans had already found her. At 1530, scout planes from Enterprise sighted the lone Japanese carrier. Her deck was crowded with aircraft preparing for a third strike. Within an hour, McCluskey's dive bombers were airborne again, streaking toward the last enemy. The sun was low now, the ocean glowing gold beneath the clouds. At 1700 hours, the American bombers arrived. Hiryu's lookout spotted them too late. The first bomb struck near the aft elevator, the second amidships, the third tearing through the hangar. Flames erupted instantly, racing across the deck. Explosions followed, torpedoes, bombs, fuel. The air filled with smoke and shrapnel. Admiral Yamaguchi stood on the bridge, refusing evacuation. As fire consumed the ship, he ordered the crew to save themselves. Many refused, choosing to die with their vessel. At 1930 hours, the order was given. Hiryu was to be scuttled. She slipped beneath the waves, her flag still flying. The Pacific fell silent once more. By nightfall, 4 of Japan's first-line carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, were gone. Over 300 aircraft destroyed. More than 3,000 sailors lost. In return, the U.S. had lost 1 carrier, the Yorktown, and 307 men. Above the wreckage, the stars returned. The sea glowed faintly from the burning oil. Survivors floated in silence, clinging to debris as the night wind carried the faint crackle of distant fires. For Japan, the laughter that had echoed across Akagi's wardroom that morning was now replaced by the sound of burning steel and sinking dreams. For America, Midway was not yet a victory. It was a survival bought at unimaginable cost. But when the smoke cleared, the balance of the Pacific had shifted forever. The age of the battleship was over. The carrier, once mocked as a toy, had proven itself the new monarch of the seas. And from this day forward, Japan would fight not to conquer, but to endure. The morning after the battle, the Pacific lay eerily still. Oil slicks stretched for miles, shimmering like black glass. Bits of wreckage floated in the quiet water. Fragments of flight decks, broken propellers, and the lifeless bodies of sailors who had once believed in invincibility. For the Japanese Navy, it was a scene beyond comprehension. Just 6 months earlier, they had been the masters of the Pacific, their flagships victorious at Pearl Harbor, their admirals confident in divine favor. Now, 4 of their proudest carriers lay at the bottom of the sea. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Japan's naval dominance, received the news aboard his flagship Yamato. He read the reports in silence. His officers waited for orders that never came. Yamamoto simply turned away from the map table and walked to the deck, staring out at the horizon. So, he murmured to himself, the tide has turned. The loss was more than ships and men. It was an entire generation of Japan's elite naval aviators. Over 100 experienced pilots perished at Midway, along with skilled mechanics, deck crews, and flight leaders. These were men who had trained for years, through a system that could not easily replace them. The Imperial Navy could still field new aircraft. It could build new ships, but it could not rebuild experience. In contrast, the United States Navy, though bloodied, had gained something irreplaceable: confidence. The victory at Midway shattered the myth of Japanese invincibility that had haunted Allied morale since Pearl Harbor. It proved that intelligence, coordination, and sheer resolve could overcome even the most disciplined enemy. The secret weapon behind this triumph was not firepower alone, right? It was information. American codebreakers led by Commander Joseph Rochefort had deciphered enough of the Japanese naval code JN-25 to predict the target of their next attack. Without that intelligence, Midway might have been another catastrophe. Inside the Navy's Pacific Command, Admiral Chester Nimitz reviewed the battle reports with quiet satisfaction. He knew how close it had been, a matter of hours, even minutes. Luck, he admitted later, played its part. But fortune tends to favor those who are prepared. Across the ocean in Tokyo, the Imperial General Headquarters struggled to frame the defeat. Early communique described the battle as a draw. Newspapers spoke of minor losses. But within naval circles, the truth was undeniable. Officers who had laughed at America's toy carriers now faced the ruin of the very doctrine they had trusted. The battleship, once the pride of Japan's Navy, had played almost no role at Midway. The carrier, once seen as auxiliary, had decided the outcome of the war's greatest sea battle. The loss also exposed Japan's logistical weakness. With 4 carriers gone, their ability to project air power across the Pacific collapsed. Plans for a second wave of expansion, toward Hawaii, Australia, or even the American West Coast, were quietly abandoned. And yet, despite the magnitude of the defeat, Japan did not surrender its resolve. In the months that followed, shipyards in Kure and Nagasaki worked without pause, launching replacement carriers like Shokaku and Zuikaku. Pilots were rushed through accelerated training programs, often with tragic results. But the illusion was gone. For the first time, Japan's admirals began to realize that the war they had started could not be won through audacity alone. In Washington, President Franklin D. Roosevelt was briefed on the battle's outcome. His reaction was measured, cautious optimism. "This," he said, "is only the beginning of the end of the beginning." Midway did not end the Pacific War, but it marked the moment when the tide turned, when the hunter became the hunted, and the toy carriers became the weapon that would one day bring Japan's empire to its knees. As survivors were rescued from the sea and wreckage drifted westward with the currents, the world's balance had shifted, quietly, permanently. The Pacific, once Japan's domain, was now contested ground, and every commander, American or Japanese, knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The weeks following Midway were filled with silence in Japan's press and confusion within its navy. The once celebrated carrier striking force, Kido Butai, no longer existed. Its ships, air crews, and the aura of invincibility that had defined it were gone. In Tokyo, the Naval General Staff convened behind closed doors. The atmosphere was heavy, the faces drawn. Reports arrived from scattered survivors. Burned pilots rescued from the waves, sailors adrift for days, officers missing in action. There was disbelief that such a disaster could have occurred so swiftly, in less than a single day. Admiral Yamamoto, ever stoic, accepted full responsibility. He blamed no one but himself for overextending Japan's reach. Yet even he could not reverse the damage. The naval balance that had taken decades to build, through skill, secrecy, and sacrifice, had been overturned in hours. Japan's wartime strategy had hinged on a rapid offensive, to strike fast, seize resources, and force America into negotiation. But after Midway, that hope evaporated. The Imperial Navy would never again take the strategic initiative. From this point onward, every Japanese operation would be reactive, defensive, desperate, costly. Meanwhile, in the United States, the victory at Midway electrified morale. The Navy's official communiques remained cautious, but inside military circles there was an unspoken understanding. The Pacific could now be won. Factories on the American mainland shifted into overdrive. Shipyards in Newport News, Puget Sound, and San Diego began producing carriers at an unprecedented rate. Essex-class giants capable of carrying nearly 100 aircraft each. In the next 3 years, the U.S. Navy would launch more carriers than Japan had built in its entire history. The lessons of Midway shaped everything that followed. Tactics were rewritten, intelligence became sacred, coordination between codebreakers, reconnaissance units, and carrier task forces became the new foundation of warfare. The men who had fought at Midway became legends almost overnight. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, who found the Japanese fleet by instinct when his fuel was nearly gone. Lieutenant Dick Best, whose precision dive destroyed Akagi. Commander Rochefort, whose quiet code-breaking victory had made the entire ambush possible. But beyond individual heroism, Midway's legacy lay in what it revealed about modern war, that intelligence and adaptability could outweigh size and pride. For Japan, the psychological blow was immense. The officers who had once mocked the U.S. Navy now spoke in hushed tones about American persistence, the same persistence they had underestimated at Pearl Harbor. The idea that the Americans lacked discipline or courage had been shattered. In Japan's shipyards, new carriers were laid down, Taiho, Shinano, but they would never catch up. The industrial scale of the United States simply dwarfed anything Japan could produce. Each Japanese loss became irreplaceable, each American loss temporary. Midway also transformed the global perception of air power. The sea was no longer ruled by the biggest guns but by the aircraft that flew above them. The battleship era was over, its twilight marked not by a naval gun duel, but by the thunder of dive bombers descending through clouds. In the months after the battle, survivors returned home to quiet honors. Many never spoke of what they had seen, the screams in the water, the oil fires, the moments when the sky itself seemed to burn. But historians would later call Midway the most complete naval victory in history. 4 carriers lost, 1 empire halted, and the Pacific War forever changed. The laughter that had filled the Japanese war rooms before the battle was gone, replaced by silence, then by the sound of mourning bells from naval bases across the empire. For America, Midway was more than a victory. It was proof that resolve, intelligence, and courage could rewrite destiny, and as both sides rebuilt their fleets for the long struggle ahead, Guadalcanal, the Solomons, Leyte Gulf, the memory of that June morning in 1942 lingered, a shadow over every future battle. History often turns not on grand plans but on fragile moments, a missed message, a delayed order, a chance sighting over an empty ocean. Midway was one of those moments. What began as a Japanese campaign to destroy America's remaining carriers became the battle that destroyed Japan's own naval future. In 6 furious minutes above the Pacific, the balance of power in the world's largest ocean changed hands, not through luck alone, but through courage, intelligence, and adaptation. The Japanese commanders had mocked America's carriers as toys, unfit to challenge the battleship's reign. Yet it was those very carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, that defined the new age of warfare. Midway proved that mastery of the skies, not the size of a ship's guns, would decide the wars of the future. But beneath the strategy and steel lay something deeper, a story of endurance. The American pilots who climbed into fragile, dauntless dive bombers, knowing that half would never return. The Japanese sailors who fought on burning decks, refusing to abandon their posts. The codebreakers in dark, windowless rooms who changed the course of history without ever seeing the sea. Their courage came in different forms, some loud, some silent, but all bound by the same truth, that war is never just machinery and numbers. It is human will measured in seconds and sacrifices. Midway's legacy was not only a turning point in the Pacific, but a lesson written in flame and salt water, that arrogance can sink even the mightiest fleets, and that adaptability is the truest weapon of survival. By the war's end in 1945, Japan's empire lay in ruins, and the carrier, once derided as a novelty, had become the unquestioned ruler of the seas. But the echoes of Midway remained. Every modern navy, every admiral studying the art of war still turns back to that morning in June 1942, when the laughter aboard Akagi fell silent, and the future of naval warfare was born in fire. The Pacific swallowed the wrecks long ago, but beneath those quiet waters the lesson endures.